Hello friends, welcome back to this exercise series part 2. In this, how much exercise is enough and can too much exercise harm the heart? Does walking really count as exercise? Is vigorous exercise always better? Can many years of endurance training cause atrial fibrillation, coronary calcium or scarring in the heart? And should everyone undergo cardiac testing before beginning exercise? In this video, we are going to understand 5 important things. First, whether the total amount of movement or the intensity of the movement matters more. Second, where the greatest health benefit comes from exercise appears to occur. Third, why strenuous exercises can temporarily trigger a cardiac event even though regular exercise protects the heart over the long term. And number 4, what scientists mean by alternative hypothesis, the possibility that extremely high exercise volumes may reduce some of the benefit. And fifth, how we can move safely from inactivity to moderate and vigorous exercise. If you are short of time, you can go directly to the end of this video where I have summarized the 5 most important key take-home messages from this video. But to understand why those messages matter, let us first look at the evidence. This video is based mainly from 2 publications from 2020. The first is an article by Professor Jason Gill in Natural Medicine discussing a study by Strain and colleagues involving 96,476 participants from UK Biobank. The important difference is in this study was that the physical activity was measured objectively using wrist-worn accelerometers rather than relying only on questionnaire. Second publication is comprehensive scientific statement from American Heart Association led by Barry Franklin and colleagues. It examines both the enormous cardiovascular benefits of exercise and the possible immediate and long-term risk associated with vigorous or very high volume exercise. Let's begin with the first question. What matters more, the amount of movement or its intensity? The answer appears to be both matters. Think about physical activity as having 2 components. The first is the volume. That means the total amount of movement and expenditure accumulated throughout the day. The second is intensity. That means how much of this movement reaches moderate or vigorous effort. Gentle walking, household activity, and light movement contribute mainly to total volume. Brisk walking, faster cycling, running, or climbing stairs may contribute moderate to vigorous activity. In the UK Biobank analysis, greater total physical activity was associated with a lower risk of mortality, but there was an important finding. At the same total physical activity energy expenditure, approximately 15 kilojoules per kilogram per day, increasing the proportion performed at moderate to vigorous intensity from about 10% to 20%, equivalent to roughly 7 versus 16 minutes per day, was associated with a 30% lower mortality risk. The words associated with are important. This was an observational study, doesn't prove that increasing intensity directly caused the lower mortality risk. Increasing the total amount of movement was associated with substantial benefit. So this is not a competition between walking and vigorous exercise. It is not. Either walk more or exercise harder. The evidence suggests that increasing total movement and gradually adding some intensity may both be valuable. The most important observation was that the largest potential improvement occurred among people with the lowest activity levels. In other words, the first step away from inactivity may produce a much greater health benefit than adding another difficult workout to an already highly active person's program. At higher levels of total activity, the mortality benefit appeared to flatten. This does not mean that additional exercise suddenly became harmful. It means that extra benefit from doing still more became progressively smaller. There are also limitations. The follow-up was relatively short, approximately 3 years. Undiagnosed illness may have caused some participants to move less, which can create reverse causality. We should therefore not convert these findings into a rigid calorie target or assume that every smartwatch calorie estimate means exactly the same. The practical message is simpler. For an inactive person, the first priority is not to create a perfect exercise program. The first priority is to begin moving, walk more, reduce prolonged sitting, accumulate more movement throughout the day. Then as your body adapts, gradually allow some of that movement to become brisker. Now let us address the apparent contradiction. If exercise protects the heart, how can strenuous exercise temporarily trigger a heart attack or sudden cardiac arrest? Regular physical activity improves the cardiorespiratory fitness and lowers long-term cardiovascular risk. But during one particular bout of strenuous exercise, heart rate rises, blood pressure rises, and the heart requires more oxygen. In a susceptible person, that sudden cardiovascular demand may temporarily increase the risk of myocardial infarction or sudden cardiac death. The key word is temporarily. The relative risk can rise during and shortly after vigorous exertion, but the absolute risk remains very small. In the Physicians' Health Society, vigorous exertion temporarily increased the relative risk of sudden cardiac death. However, the absolute risk remained extremely low, approximately one sudden cardiac death for every 1.5 million episodes of vigorous exertion. This estimate came from population studied which consisted predominantly of male physicians. It should not be treated as one universal risk figure for every person. The triggering effect was greatest in habitually inactive people who suddenly perform unfamiliar strenuous exercises. Regular exercise substantially reduced the magnitude of this temporary risks. So the message is not vigorous exercise is dangerous. The more accurate message is a sudden, unfamiliar, vigorous exercise may be dangerous for an unprepared person with an unsuspected vulnerable heart. The dangerous combination is often an inactive individual, an unrecognized cardiovascular problem, and a sudden heroic effort. This is why consistency matters. Intensity should be earned gradually. Now let us look at the dose response graph presented in AHA statement. The first graph, which I'm showing it now on the screen, represents the current or curvilinear model. At the beginning of the graph, the person performing no exercise has the highest health risk. As the person begins exercising, the risks fall sharply. The first reduction is very important. It tells us that the moving from nothing to something may produce the greatest gain. As exercise volume continues to increase, the risk may continue to fall, but the curve becomes progressively flatter. The person may still gain additional benefit, but each extra hour produces a smaller additional improvement. This is the usual curvilinear model. Look at the second graph. This represents the alternative hypothesis. In this model, the risk initially falls as exercise increases. There is an optimal range where the benefit is the greatest, but at the extremely high exercise volumes, the curve begins to rise again. This would mean that some of the health benefit is partially lost at the highest exercise doses. This is sometimes described as reverse J or U-shaped association. However, this alternative hypothesis must be interpreted carefully. According to AHA statement, there was no compelling evidence at that time to reject the usual curvilinear model for overall cardiovascular outcomes and mortality. In fact, observational studies of elite endurance athletes generally showed that they lived longer than the general population. The statement reported that elite athletes lived approximately 3 to 6 years longer on average, although genetics, lifestyle, and social economic differences may also contribute. Therefore, a flattening of the benefit curve is not the same as proven harm. The fact that someone gains little additional mortality benefit from adding more exercise does not mean that the exercise is damaging the heart. Atrial fibrillation may be an possible exception. Before discussing atrial fibrillation and myocardial fibrosis, let me make the population very clear. We are not talking about someone walking briskly for 30 minutes. We are not talking about someone exercising in a gym 3 times a week. We are not talking about ordinary recreational running, zone 2 training, or standard physical activity recommendations. We are discussing a relatively small group of endurance athletes who may have accumulated very high training volumes over many years, sometimes thousands of hours of vigorous endurance exercises. In some long-term endurance athletes, atrial fibrillation appears to be more common. The American Heart Association statement describes a possible J-shaped association. Low fitness and inactivity may be associated with higher atrial fibrillation risk. Moderate activity may reduce the risk. But in some people performing very high volumes of vigorous training over many years, the risk may rise again. Possible explanations include the enlargement of the left atrium, changes in the autonomic tone, sustained hemodynamic stress, inflammation, and individual genetic susceptibility. But this does not mean that ordinary exercise causes atrial fibrillation. In fact, improving fitness may reduce atrial fibrillation symptoms and recurrence in many patients. The concern is conditional. It applies mainly to selected individuals exposed to very high volumes of endurance exercise over a prolonged period. Now let us discuss coronary artery calcium. Some studies have found more coronary artery calcium in male master endurance athletes than in less active control patients. At first, that sounds alarming. However, the athletes often had a greater proportion of heavily calcified plaques and fewer mixed plaques. Heavily calcified plaques are generally considered more stable than lipid rich or mixed plaques. The clinical meaning remains uncertain. An athlete with coronary calcium should not simply be told that the calcium is harmless, but the calcium score should also not be interpreted in isolation without considering fitness, symptoms, cardiovascular risk factors, and play characteristics. The American Heart Association statement also discusses myocardial fibrosis. The cardiac MRI studies have found late gadolinium enhancement in minority of highly trained endurance athletes. Late gadolinium enhancement can sometimes represent myocardial fibrosis or scar tissue. However, in athletes, it may also reflect inflammation, edema, or changes near the insertion points of the right ventricle. The long-term clinical significance in otherwise healthy athletes remains uncertain. So the message is not extreme exercises damages everyone's heart. The more accurate message is the biological response to many years of exceptionally high volume endurance training may differ from the response to ordinary health promoting exercises. Some individuals may develop atrial fibrillation or cardiac imaging abnormalities, but the size of the risk, the people most susceptible, and the clinical meaning of some findings remain incompletely understood. Now, before the 5 take-home messages, let me tell you what happened to Durai. Durai watched a video saying that vigorous exercise could produce additional cardiovascular benefit. The next morning, after several years of avoiding the staircase, he stood in front of a 5-storied building. He adjusted his shoes, he looked at the stairs, and he announced confidently, "Today I am doing high intensity training." He began sprinting. Halfway through the second floor, he stopped. He held the railing with both hands, and Kamala slowly walked up behind him. She looked at him and asked, "Enanga, what happened?" Durai, breathing heavily, replied, "The doctor said intensity is very important." Kamala looked at him for a few seconds and said, "He also said gradual progression. Did you skip that part in the video?" Durai nodded reluctantly and said, "I was short of time, so I went directly to vigorous exercise part of the video. That is exactly what we should not do. You cannot compensate for 10 years of inactivity in one Sunday morning. The intensity must be built on consistency." Now let us finish with the 5 most important take-home messages from this video. Take-home message number 1, any movement is better than none. The greatest potential health gain belongs to those who are currently inactive. Begin with walking, ordinary daily movement, and reducing prolonged sitting. Take-home message number 2, both volume and intensity matter. Increase your total daily movement first, then, when appropriate, gradually allow some of that activity to become moderate or vigorous. And take home message number 3, intensity must be earned progressively. Avoid sudden, unfamiliar, all out exercise, particularly after prolonged inactivity. Regular training reduces temporary triggering risk associated with vigorous exertion. Take home message number 4, a plateau in benefit is not the same as proven harm. At very high exercise volumes, additional mortality benefit may become smaller. That does not automatically mean that exercise is damaging the heart. Concerns about atrial fibrillation, coronary calcium, and myocardial fibrosis relate mainly to selected individuals performing very high volume endurance exercise over many years, not to everyday health promoting activities. Take home message number 5, never ignore warning symptoms. Stop exercising and seek medical assessment if you develop chest pain or pressure, fainting or near fainting, unusual breathlessness, new palpitations, or an unexplained major reduction in exercise capacity. For most people, the greater health danger remains too little activity and not too much exercise. Move more, build consistency, and add intensity gradually, and pay attention to warning symptoms. Disclaimer, this video is intended only for general education and does not replace an individual medical consultation, examination, or exercise prescription. People with known cardiovascular, metabolic, or renal disease, significant risk factors concerning symptoms, or plans to begin strenuous competitive exercise should discuss an appropriate evaluation and exercise progression with their training physician. Stop exercise and seek urgent medical care for chest discomfort, fainting, severe unexplained breathlessness, or other concerning symptoms. The discussion on volume and intensity is based on Gill's commentary on accelerometer measured physical activity in 96,476 UK Biobank participants. The discussion on acute cardiovascular risk, the physician health study estimate of approximately 1 sudden cardiac death per 1.5 million episodes of vigorous exertion, the dose response model, atrial fibrillation, coronary calcium, and myocardial fibrosis is based on the American Heart Association scientific statement by Franklin and colleagues. See you in the next video, friends. Until then, goodbye.